Sarah Michelle Anderson adjusted her grandmother's pearl necklace one final time as she stood before the full-length mirror in the bridal suite of the Rosewood Country Club. In 20 minutes, she would walk down the aisle to marry David Harrison, the man she'd fallen for 18 months ago at a charity auction in downtown Boston. Her silk wedding dress, custom-made by a designer in New York, caught the afternoon light streaming through the windows. Everything was perfect. Too perfect, as she was about to discover. The door to the bridal suite was slightly ajar, and voices from the hallway drifted in. Sarah recognized David's distinctive laugh immediately, that confident, almost arrogant chuckle that had initially charmed her but lately seemed forced. Curious, she moved closer to listen. "Dude, are you seriously going through with this?" The voice belonged to Marcus, David's best man and college roommate. "Of course I'm going through with it," David replied, his tone completely different from the loving voice he used with Sarah. Cold, calculating. "Do you know how long I've been working on this? Sarah Anderson is my ticket to the big leagues, man. Her father's construction empire is worth over 20 million. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp. She pressed herself against the wall, heart pounding. But what if she finds out? Another voice asked Tyler, one of the groomsmen. Finds out what? That I specifically targeted her at that charity auction? That I researched her family for months before we accidentally met? David's laugh was bitter. Sarah's too trusting, too romantic. She actually believes in fairy tales. By the time we get back from our honeymoon in Italy, I'll have convinced her father to make me a partner in his business. Give me 6 months, and I'll have access to everything. Sarah felt the world spinning around her. The charity auction where they met that magical night when David had bid on the same art piece as her, then gallantly let her win before asking her to dinner. It was all orchestrated. And the gambling debts? Marcus pressed. What about them? Once I'm family, Richard Anderson will help his son-in-law out of any financial troubles. The old man's traditional like that. And if he doesn't? David paused ominously. Well, accidents happen. Sarah would inherit everything eventually. The blood drained from Sarah's face. David wasn't just planning to use her. He was considering harming her father. Jesus, David, I'm talking about survival. David cut Tyler off. You think I have a choice? I owe $300,000 to some very dangerous people. They've already made it clear what happens if I don't pay up by the end of this month. Sarah Anderson is my only way out. But she loves you, man. Don't you feel anything for her? David's response was like a knife through Sarah's heart. Love? Tyler, she's a means to an end. A very wealthy, very naive means to an end. I'll play the loving husband for as long as it takes. After I secure my position in the company and pay off my debts, well, we'll see how long the marriage lasts. Sarah slumped against the wall, struggling to breathe. 18 months of memories flashed through her mind. Their first date, his proposal on the beach in Cape Cod, meeting our parents, planning this wedding. All of it was a lie. Time to go, gentlemen, came another voice, the wedding coordinator. The ceremony starts in 10 minutes. Sarah heard footsteps moving away and forced herself to stand upright. She looked at herself in the mirror again. The woman staring back looked the same, but everything had changed. The romantic, trusting Sarah Anderson was gone. In her place stood someone who now understood exactly what kind of man she was about. To marry, but she wasn't going to run. She wasn't going to cancel the wedding and humiliate herself in front of 200 guests. Instead, she was going to give David Harrison exactly what he wanted and exactly what he deserved. Sarah picked up her phone and quickly typed a message to her younger sister, Emma, who was studying law at Harvard. Emergency. Need you to research David Harrison immediately. Financial records, background, everything. Something's very wrong. Emma's response came within seconds. What happened? Are you okay? I'll explain later. Just find everything you can. And don't tell Mom and Dad yet. Sarah put her phone away and took a deep breath. She had a wedding to attend and a performance to give. David thought he was marrying a naive heiress. He was about to marry someone much more dangerous than that. The wedding march began, and Sarah's father, Richard Anderson, appeared at the door of the bridal suite. At 62, he was still imposing, a self-made man who'd built Anderson Construction from a single truck into one of Boston's largest contracting companies. You look beautiful, sweetheart, he said, offering his arm. Ready to become Mrs. Harrison? More ready than you know, Dad, Sarah replied, linking her arm through his dot as they walked down the aisle. Sarah smiled and nodded at the guests, playing her part perfectly. She saw David waiting at the altar, handsome in his designer tuxedo, beaming with what she now knew was false emotion. To everyone else, he looked like a man in love. To Sarah, he looked like exactly what he was, a predator. When they reached the altar, Richard kissed Sarah's cheek and placed her hand in David's. Take care of my little girl, he said. I promise, Mr. Anderson. She means everything to me. David replied smoothly. Sarah almost laughed at the irony. Everything literally. The ceremony proceeded as planned. Sarah said her vows with conviction, promising to love and honor David, for better or worse, in sickness and in health. She meant every word, but not in the way anyone thought. She would love the opportunity to teach him about worse, and she would honor her commitment to see this through to the end. When David spoke his vows, Sarah watched his face carefully. He was a talented actor. She had to give him that. If she hadn't overheard his conversation, she might have been moved to tears by his performance. You may kiss the bride, the officiant announced. David's kiss was passionate, possessive. The crowd cheered and applauded. Sarah smiled brightly and waved to the guests, the perfect picture of a happy bride. During the cocktail hour at the reception, Sarah excused herself to check her phone. Emma had sent a preliminary report that made her stomach turn. Sarah, this is bad. David Harrison has massive gambling debts, casino markers, illegal sports betting, loan sharks. His credit is destroyed, but that's not the worst part. He's done this before. I found records of him being engaged to 2 other wealthy women in the past 3 years. Both engagements were broken off mysteriously. I'm still digging, but I think you married a professional con artist. Sarah typed back. Keep digging. I need everything by tomorrow morning. She returned to the reception and threw herself into playing the role of the happy bride. During dinner, David was charming and attentive, regaling their table with stories about their relationship. Every anecdote was perfectly crafted to reinforce the image of their storybook romance. To think, David said, raising his glass, if I hadn't bid on that painting at the charity auction, we might never have met. Fate works in mysterious ways, Sarah replied, clinking her glass against his. If only the guests knew how mysterious. Later, during their first dance to At Last, by Etta James, David held her close and whispered in her ear, I can't wait to start our life together, Mrs. Harrison. Neither can I, Sarah whispered back. I have a feeling it's going to be full of surprises. That night, in their honeymoon suite at the Four Seasons, Sarah pleaded exhaustion and convinced David to postpone their wedding night. She needed time to think, to plan. David was disappointed, but understanding the perfect, considerate husband. While he slept, Sarah sat in the bathroom, reading Emma's complete report on her phone. The picture it painted was even worse than she'd imagined. David Harrison was indeed a professional predator who targeted wealthy women. The 2 previous engagements had ended when the women's families hired private investigators who uncovered his debts and criminal associations. But Sarah Also learned something that gave her an idea for the perfect revenge. David's creditors weren't just loan sharks. Some of them had connections to federal investigators who were building cases against illegal gambling operations. David was potentially valuable as a witness. If he could be convinced to cooperate. The next morning, David was eager to discuss their future over room service breakfast. "Sarah, I've been thinking about my role in your father's company," he began. Carefully. "I'd really like to contribute more than just being the boss's son-in-law." "What did you have in mind?" Sarah asked, buttering her croissant. "Well, I have some experience with business operations. Maybe I could help with some of the financial planning, contract negotiations, that sort of thing." Sarah pretended to consider this. "That's a wonderful idea. Dad's always looking for fresh perspectives. I'll talk to him about giving you more responsibility." David's eyes lit up. "Really? You'd do that?" "Of course. We're partners now, aren't we? What's good for you is good for our family." That afternoon, Sarah called her father. "Dad, David's really excited about contributing more to the company. He has some ideas about expanding operations." "Does he now?" Richard sounded skeptical. "Sarah, I like David, but he's been with us for less than 6 months. Don't you think it's a bit early to give him significant responsibilities?" "Maybe, but Dad, he's my husband now. Shouldn't we show some trust? Besides, you could always monitor what he's doing closely." Richard was quiet for a moment. "All right, I'll create a position for him in business development. But Sarah, I want to keep a close eye on any projects he works on." "That sounds perfect, Dad." Over the next 2 weeks, Sarah played the role of the supportive wife beautifully. She encouraged David's ambitions, suggested he ask for access to company files to better understand the business, and even hinted that her father might be willing to give him signing authority for smaller contracts. David, meanwhile, was becoming increasingly nervous. His creditors were growing impatient, and he was pushing harder for access to company finances. Sarah could see the desperation beneath his charming facade. "Sarah," he said one evening as they had dinner at their apartment, "do you think your father would be willing to lend us some money? I have some outstanding debts from before we met, and I'd rather clear them up quickly." "How much money are we talking about?" Sarah asked innocently. "Maybe 100,000? I know it sounds like a lot, but, David, that's not a lot for my family. Dad probably spends that much on new equipment every month. I'm sure he'd be happy to help." David's relief was palpable. "You think so? I know so? In fact, why don't you ask him directly? Show him you're responsible enough to handle your own financial affairs." The next day, Sarah called Emma. "It's time for phase 2. I need you to contact the FBI agents working on those gambling cases. Tell them I have information about David Harrison." "Sarah, are you sure about this? If David finds out, he won't." "Find out. Trust me." That evening, David came home from work excited. "Sarah, your father agreed to lend me the money. He's having the company lawyers draw up the paperwork tomorrow." "That's wonderful, honey. See, I told you he'd want to help." Family. But Sarah had already spoken to her father about a different plan. Richard Anderson had built his company by being smart, careful, and decisive. When Sarah had finally told him the truth about David, not everything, but enough, he'd been furious. However, he'd agreed to Sarah's plan for gathering evidence. The loan documents that David signed the next day weren't standard personal loan agreements. They were corporate guarantees that required David to use his position in the company to secure the debt. By signing them, David had unknowingly created a paper trail that would be crucial evidence later. Meanwhile, Emma had made contact with FBI agent Jennifer Martinez, who was leading an investigation into a network of illegal gambling operations. Agent Martinez was very interested in David Harrison, who appeared on several of their surveillance tapes, making large bets and receiving threats from known criminals. "Your sister's husband is in serious danger," Agent Martinez told Emma during their meeting. "But he could also be exactly the break we need in this case." These gambling operations are connected to much larger criminal enterprises. Sarah spent the next month carefully documenting David's activities. She installed security cameras in their apartment under the guise of home protection. She recorded phone conversations where David discussed his plans to maximize his access to Anderson Construction's resources. Most importantly, she gathered evidence of his meetings with his creditors, meetings that were also of great interest to federal investigators. The turning point came when David made his biggest mistake. Emboldened by his success in obtaining the loan and his growing access to company operations, he decided to accelerate his timeline. He used his company credit card to pay gambling debts directly, then altered the expense reports to make it appear as if the charges were for legitimate business purposes. Sarah discovered the altered reports when she accidentally saw them on David's laptop. She photographed everything and immediately sent copies to Emma, her father, and Agent Martinez. "This is it," Agent Martinez told Sarah during a secretly recorded phone call. "This is enough for us to move forward. But Sarah, once we arrest David, your marriage is going to become evidence in a federal case. Are you prepared for that?" Agent Martinez: "My marriage was over the moment I heard him plotting to use my family. I'm more than ready." The arrest happened on a Thursday morning at Anderson Construction's headquarters. David was in a meeting with Richard and two potential clients when FBI agents walked into the conference room. "David Harrison, you're under arrest for wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit extortion." David's face went white as the agents read him his rights. He looked around the room desperately, his eyes finally landing on Richard Anderson. "Mr. Anderson, this is a mistake. I can explain everything." Richard's expression was cold as stone. "David, the only mistake here was thinking you could steal from my family." As David was led away in handcuffs, Sarah watched from her father's office window. She felt no satisfaction, only a sense of closure. The naive young woman who had fallen for David's charm was gone, replaced by someone who understood that trust must be earned and verified. The investigation revealed the full scope of David's criminal activities. He had defrauded 3 other families before targeting the Andersons, stealing over $2 million in total. His gambling debts were part of a larger money laundering operation that the FBI had been investigating for years. During the trial, Sarah testified about David's plans to gain access to her family's wealth. The recordings she had made, combined with the financial evidence gathered by investigators, painted a clear picture of calculated fraud. David's lawyer tried to argue that his client had genuinely fallen in love with Sarah and that his criminal activities were separate from their relationship. Sarah's testimony destroyed that defense. "Your Honor," she said from the witness stand, "the defendant never loved me. He loved what I represented: access to my family's money. Every moment of our relationship, from our first meeting to our wedding day, was part of an elaborate con game." David was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. His creditors, many of whom were also arrested as part of the broader investigation, would no longer be a threat to anyone. 6 months after David's conviction, Sarah was having coffee with Emma at a cafe near Harvard's campus. "So," Emma said, "any regrets about how you handled everything?" Sarah thought for a moment. "I regret marrying him in the first place. I regret not seeing the signs earlier. But I don't regret making sure he faced consequences for what he did." "And the fact that you're technically still married to a federal prisoner?" Sarah laughed. "The divorce will be final next month." Turns out fraud is excellent grounds for an annulment. A year later, Sarah met Thomas Chun, a pediatric surgeon at Boston Children's Hospital. Their first date was coffee, and a walk through the public garden, nothing fancy, nothing calculated. Thomas was kind, honest, and had no idea about her family's wealth until they'd been dating for 3 months. When Thomas finally learned about her money, his reaction was to worry that she might think he was using her for financial gain. "Sarah, I need you to know that your family's money doesn't matter to me," he said nervously during dinner at a small Italian restaurant. "I hope you don't think—" "Thomas," Sarah interrupted, taking his hand, "the fact that you're worried about that tells me everything I need to know about your character." They were married 2 years later in a small ceremony, with just immediate family present. Sarah wore her grandmother's pearls again, but this time they were paired with a simple dress she'd bought off the rack. The venue was the garden behind her parents' house, not a country club. The guest list was 30 people, not 200. Richard Anderson walked his daughter down the aisle again, but this time his smile was genuine and relaxed. "This one's different," he whispered to Sarah as they approached the small altar where Thomas waited. "Yes," Sarah replied, "this one's real." During their vows, Sarah promised to love Thomas with honesty, trust, and an open heart. She meant every word, but she also kept her own private vow to never again ignore her instincts or let romance blind her to reality. The reception was catered by a local restaurant, not a 5-star hotel. The wedding cake was made by a friend of Emma's who ran a small bakery. The music was provided by Thomas's cousin with a guitar and a decent voice. It was perfect as Sarah and Thomas danced their first dance to "The Way You Look Tonight." She caught her father's eye across the garden. He raised his glass to her and smiled. The message was clear. This time she'd chosen well. 5 years later, Sarah and Thomas had 2 children and a life built on genuine love and mutual respect. Sarah had taken over day-to-day operations of Anderson Construction, while Richard gradually retired. The company was more successful than ever, having learned valuable lessons about trust and verification from the David Harrison experience. Emma, now a successful prosecutor, specialized in white-collar crime cases. She often told colleagues that her sister's experience had inspired her career choice. "Some people think justice is about revenge," Emma would say, "but real justice is about preventing the same crime from happening to others." David Harrison served his full sentence. Upon his release, he left Massachusetts and disappeared into obscurity. Sarah occasionally wondered what had become of him, but she didn't dwell on it. He was part of her past, not her future. The real lesson from Sarah's experience wasn't about revenge or justice. It was about the difference between love and manipulation, between trust and naivety. She had learned to protect herself without becoming cynical, to be cautious without being fearful. On quiet evenings, when she and Thomas were putting their children to bed, Sarah sometimes thought about that young woman in the bridal suite at the Rosewood Country Club. That woman had been devastated by betrayal, but had found the strength to fight back intelligently and methodically. Sarah was proud of her younger self for not running away, for not letting David's betrayal break her spirit. Instead, she had used the experience to become stronger, smarter, and ultimately happier. The last time anyone in the Anderson family heard David Harrison's name was in a news article about a white-collar crime prevention program that used his case as a teaching example. The article quoted a federal prosecutor saying, "The Harrison case demonstrates that financial predators can be stopped when their victims are brave enough to fight back and smart enough to gather evidence." Sarah framed that article and hung it in her office at Anderson Construction, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. A reminder that trust should be earned, that love should be genuine, and that sometimes the best revenge is simply living well and ensuring that justice is served. The naive romantic who had believed in fairy tales was gone, but in her place stood a woman who had created her own happy ending, one built on truth, genuine love, and the hard-won wisdom that comes from surviving betrayal and emerging stronger on the other side.